I have been a constant reader of Stephen King's for almost 40 years. And in that time, well before I had a YouTube channel, I often had people ask me two questions about Stephen King's books. Number one, where do I start? And number two, I've read this book, this book, this book. What should I read next? Well, I'm going to attempt to answer those questions next. So with Stephen King, where do I start and where do I go next are two of the toughest questions that you could ask. For a couple reasons. First of all, his output is so huge. You can't even see two more shelves that I have of my Stephen King collection. About 80 volumes of work. So that's a lot to choose from if I'm going to give you one recommendation or one recommendation of where to go next. Additionally, King doesn't just write in one style. He doesn't just write horror, even though he's the king of horror. He writes in a lot of different veins. So because of that, I put together this video in an attempt to answer those questions a little bit more clearly. What I've done in this video is I've separated King's works into 5 categories: horror, fantasy and magical realism, crime fiction, short fiction, and nonfiction. And in those 5 categories, I'm going to give you a broad overview of everything within that category. And then I'm going to give you a short list of 4 or 5 titles within that category that would answer the question, hopefully, for a lot of you, where do I go next? Additionally, I'm going to give you one selection I think is a good entry point for King in that different category. So I've kind of waffled a little bit with these 2 questions, where do I start, where do I go next, because I'm going to give you 5 answers, one for each of these categories of the 2 questions. Additionally, I will talk at the very end about The Dark Tower, and I'll give you some reading advice for that that's a little bit beyond the 7 books. Now, based on this video, what you see, this is not for my constant readers. But my constant readers, I'd really like you to stick around. The target audience for this video is people who are just starting their King journey, or they've just started and they're not sure where to go next. So that's where you can come in and you can comment below. You can answer these questions in the 5 categories in the comments below. So of these categories, answer where you think a great entry point would be, as well as what your short list that would be great representation of that specific category for a reader. Now, I have just one minor disclaimer here. A lot of King's books cross genres. In fact, you could pick a book like The Outsider and you could say that it's horror, you could say that it's crime fiction, or you could even say that it's fantasy or magical realism. I didn't want to put a lot of these genre-bending books into multiple categories, so I just picked one and stuck it there. Generally speaking, I pulled it away from the horror category because it was so many books in that category, and I put it into crime fiction, or I put it into fantasy and magical realism just to bolster those categories a little bit more. So if you're wondering where your favorite horror novel is and it's not on that horror list, I didn't forget it. I just put it in one of the other categories. So let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to start with, since he's the king of horror, let's start with the horror genre. Here is an overview of all of Stephen King's novels, including the ones he wrote as Richard Bachman. The Shining, Carrie, Salem's Lot, Firestarter, Cujo, Pet Sematary, Christine, Thinner, It, Misery, The Tommyknockers, The Dark Half, Needful Things, Gerald's Game, Dolores Claiborne, Rose Madder, Desperation, The Regulators, Insomnia, Dreamcatcher, From a Buick 8, Lisey's Story, Duma Key, Revival, and Sleeping Beauties, co-written with his son Owen King. For the short list, I've chosen 5 examples. The Shining, a story of a haunted hotel in Colorado. Salem's Lot, perhaps one of the greatest vampire stories ever told. Pet Sematary, a cemetery where the pets come to life, but a story that's much more than that. It, a story of ancient evil told over multiple generations. Needful Things, a wild card pick, but one of my favorites. Perhaps the hardest choice I had to make on this video is one entry point into the horror genre. I chose The Shining. I think The Shining is a mostly universally loved book of King's. I think it showcases so much of what he does well. He has a young protagonist. King is a master of writing young protagonists and writing children. It's scary as can be. perfect horror genre entry, and the atmosphere that he paints in this book is just incredible. Even if you've seen the excellent film by Kubrick, you can read the book because there are significant differences between the two. I think this is a great entry point into the horror genre. We move next to fantasy and magical realism. An overview: The Long Walk, written as Richard Bachman; The Stand; The Dead Zone; The Running Man, written by Richard Bachman; The Talisman, co-written with Peter Straub; The Eyes of the Dragon; The Green Mile; Black House, written with Peter Straub; Under the Dome; 11/22/63; Dr. Sleep; Gwendy's Button Box, co-written with Richard Chizmar; The Outsider; Elevation; Gwendy's Final Task, co-written with Richard Chizmar; and Fairy Tale. The 5 selections for the shortlist include The Long Walk, a precursor to the Hunger Games; The Stand, considered by many King's greatest work, his magnum opus with some of the most memorable characters you will ever meet in a dystopian landscape; The Dead Zone. The main character has some very, very interesting capabilities. The Green Mile has a great adaptation and is a story about a prisoner on death row with some magical powers. 11/22/63, my personal favorite novel by Stephen King, deals with time travel as a man goes back in time to try to prevent the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. For magical realism, I think a great entry point is The Green Mile. And The Green Mile works really well because it's not as big as some of the other ones that were in that short list, but it's written in a way that even a new reader of King can kind of ease their way into reading Stephen King. This was originally serialized in 6 different parts, and they're very, very small, smaller than a novella each. So this is a great one to enter, and there's so much that's rooted in real world, but just the magical elements, I think, is a great way to just dip the toe in the water with Stephen King's output in the fantasy and magical realism category. On to crime fiction and thrillers next. An overview: Rage, a novel by Richard Bachman; Roadwork, another one of the Bachman novels; The Colorado Kid; Blaze, another Bachman novel; Joyland; Mr. Mercedes; Finders Keepers; End of Watch; Later; Billy Summers; and Holly. On the short list, Joyland. The 3 books in the Bill Hodges trilogy: Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, End of Watch, and Later. For crime fiction, my choice is Joyland. I think this is a great one. This is one of those genre benders. There's a lot of horror elements. It is crime fiction, and if you're fighting back that it's not a crime fiction novel, the publisher is the Hard Case Crimes publication. So the publisher thinks it fits what they sell. So this works for me too. But this is a great one. It's a little pulpy, which King does that very well. And a lot of people consider this one of King's best works in the last 20 years or so. This is one that I think a lot of people talk about that have read it, and the people that haven't read it probably need to read it. So I think crime fiction, a way to enter and read King's works in this vein, is Joyland. On to short fiction. Many readers consider King's short fiction the best of what he does. Although he's primarily a novelist, his short fiction is some of the most fantastic works you will read. He has several short story collections and novellas. Now, for the scope of this video, I'm not examining anything that has not been published in a collection by Stephen King. So any short fiction that's in other collections will not be included here. The short fiction collections of Stephen King include Night Shift, Different Seasons, Skeleton Crew, 4 Past Midnight, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, Hearts in Atlantis, Everything's Eventual, Just After Sunset, Full Dark, No Stars, Bizarre Bad Dreams, If It Bleeds, and You Like It Darker. For the short list, I've chosen 2 short story collections and 2 novella collections and 1 other. The short story collections are Night Shift, King's first short story collection, shows what a brave author he was in his youth. And everything's eventual. 14 Dark Tales. One of these ties into the Dark Tower, and these 14 tales are fantastic. For the novella collections, I've chosen Different Seasons, which has 4 novellas, as well as 4 Past Midnight, which also has 4 novellas. And I've also included on this list Hearts in Atlantis, which is 5 short stories that are interwoven and, in my opinion, is one of King's most underrated works. For short fiction, I think the best entry point is Different Seasons. 4 novellas. Since King has written so many novels, I think it's better to start with a novella collection than a short story collection because it's more representative of what he does. The 4 novellas couldn't be different. It paints a picture of so much that King does very well. We have a young protagonist in one. We have magical realism in one. We have horror in one. I mean, it's just a fantastic collection. And if I had to just pick one random King book for anybody to read, if I had to answer that question I asked at the beginning of this video and not do the categories, this is usually the one that I cite as a great entry point, and perhaps the best entry point to reading Stephen King. On to nonfiction. There are only 4 selections on this list, so we're starting with the short list. King's nonfiction work includes On Writing, a memoir of the craft, Secret Windows, essays and fiction on the craft of writing. This is rare and hard to find. This was a supplement to the Book of the Month Club, and I actually had to take a picture of my own copy because I couldn't find one online. Stephen King's Danse Macabre, his history of the horror genre. And then the only book here I have not read in this entire video is a book he wrote with Stuart Onan called Faithful. 2 diehard Boston Red Sox fans chronicle the historic 2004 season. My single recommendation for nonfiction is On Writing. In fact, I wanted to recommend this book so badly. That's really the biggest reason I included a nonfiction category, even though he only wrote 4 works of nonfiction. This has it all. I mean, this is a portrait of an artist and his craft. He even takes one of his short stories where he shows you what he originally did and how he revised it. It's about writing, so any budding writer could read this and I think get a lot out of it. But I think anybody that's just interested in kind of the craft and the process of an artist, this is a perfect snapshot of that. Additionally, it tells you a little bit about King and how he writes and how he perceives his writing. So I think if maybe you're a nonfiction reader and you want to dabble into Stephen King, this might be a great entry point. But if not, I think everybody should read On Writing by Stephen King. So let's talk about The Dark Tower. Now, you can read the 7 books of The Dark Tower and you are fine. Book 1's The Gunslinger. Book 2's The Drawing of the Three. Book 3's The Wasteland. Book 4 is Wizard and Glass. Book 5, Wolves of the Kala. Book 6 is Song of Susanna. And Book 7 is called The Dark Tower. You can read these 7 and you are fine. You do not need to add more. But Stephen King has a multiverse. And in that multiverse, there's a lot of connections that lead to The Dark Tower. So I have 3 extended orders here. And the first one is kind of simple. It's just adding an 8th book here. And that 8th book is Salem's Lot, which I would recommend reading between Wizard and Glass and Wolves of the Kala. The reason is there's a character in Salem's Lot that appears in Wolves of the Kala that tells the story of Salem's Lot. So it would ruin the book for you. And Salem's Lot's amazing. I want you to read it. So if you do extended order number 1, you will read Salem's Lot between books 4 and 5. Now, extended order number 2, we're going to add 2 more books and a short story. We're going to add The Wind Through the Keyhole, which we're going to insert after Wizard and Glass. He wrote this after the series was done, and he calls it 4.5. So Dark Tower 4.5, Wind Through the Keyhole should be after Wizard and Glass and before Salem's Lot. Additionally, Insomnia feels like a Dark Tower book. There's a character that appears at the end of the series that's in Insomnia, but this is one that you don't necessarily have to read at any given point. So I would recommend either reading it before you read the series to kind of get the flavor of what this series is all about, or if you want to read it amongst these books that you're going to read between books 4 and 5, you can read it there. When King wrote the series, he finished Wizard and Glass and then did not come back to book 5 until about 20 years later, so inserting some books between there, you might get a more authentic reading experience like those of us that were waiting for the 5th book. Additionally, there's a great short story in Everything's Eventual that is a prelude a prequel, if you will, about Roland, the gunslinger. But I wouldn't read it early because I think it hits a little better if you've read it after you know the character a little bit. So maybe insert all of this extended order number 2, all of these books between books 4 and 5, and kind of have a first half of the series, second half of the series, and some of these extended books in between. Now, extended order number 3, I'm going to throw it all up on the screen at once. There it is. So the white line, all of those on the top, you could read as prelude material. Eyes of the Dragon, It, The Stand, we've already talked about Insomnia. Hearts in Atlantis has a tie-in, and the 2 books that he wrote with Peter Straub, The Talisman and Black House. You could read all of those as prelude material, or you could work them in just about anywhere. I've already talked about the books at the bottom. This is just kind of a third extended order if you want to reread all of this. If you're curious, my current reread that's taking a few years because I'm taking my time with this includes all of these. And I'm basically doing what I said, putting Wind Through the Keyhole, Salem's Lot, In Between Wolves of the Call, and reading everything else before I read the 7 books or 9 books, as it will. But this is extended order number 3. Okay, well, that's my reader's guide. I hope that this was helpful for all of you. I hope my constant readers will help me out and put some comments below. Again, I'm just one of you. I know that a lot of you probably have some great ideas that maybe I didn't think of for your short list or your entry point that I'm sure a lot of people would love to see in the comment section below. And new King readers, I would love if you take one of these recommendations and it really works for you, come back and let me know. It really makes my day. It truly does make my day anytime I see a comment that somebody took a recommendation that I made on one of these videos and they love the book. And I hope that all of you new readers or somewhat new readers turn into lifelong constant readers like me. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.